Okay, we'll go ahead and get started. We're really glad to be here with many of you tonight. And this is always a not a fun conversation, but exciting for us because we know that you are entering your final semester, your final time here at the university as a student, and beginning to prepare for what life will look like after graduation. And OPT, optional practical training, is an important part of that. And so we're really glad you're here and ready to start thinking about it. Many of you will begin submitting your applications in February, in mid-February. And so this is a really perfect timeline to begin hearing more about the process. Some of you may have joined us last fall when we did a very brief sort of takeaway presentation on you're going to have a filing fee, you're going to have some requirements to meet, here's when you want to start thinking about it. And tonight we're going to go far more in depth about what you need to know about the process, about your responsibilities, about travel while you're on OPT, what you need to know about remote work. We have just a number of different topics that we're going to cover tonight as a part of our overview. If you have questions, I would recommend that you put them in the Q&A box that you should see at the bottom of your screen. And but I suspect that Cynthia and I will answer a lot of your questions as we're going through the process. Next week, we're going to have a session specifically focused on completing the form I-765. And when you look at the 7 pages of the I-765, it doesn't seem super complicated, but there are some consistent mistakes that students make on that form and in their application. So we want to go through that process next week, next Wednesday. You should have had an RSVP link in today's email. And we highly recommend you show up for that. I think a number of your questions will get answered. You'll get the documents prepared, and then you can begin the next steps that we'll talk about tonight as well. So many of you know my colleague, Cynthia Reeves, the assistant director in ISSA, and the two of us are going to be going through the different pieces that you need to know to successfully apply for and participate in the optional practical training or OPT benefit connected to your F1 status. So where do we start? A few questions that we hope will have answered at the end and you'll feel really comfortable with these and many other pieces of information is, one, we often are asked, what is my status while I'm on OPT? And you are still in F1 status while you're in OPT. So everything that we're talking about right now, you are going to be on F1 status while you're in OPT. And the things, the requirements that you've been maintaining for the last 4 years or 2 years or 7 years are going to be somewhat similar. So we'll talk about that. Students often ask us, what does my expected timeline look like? And we want you to be asking, what does your expected timeline look like? So we're going to talk about that. Where are you planning on submitting? Where are you making different decisions? Do you have a job that may impact your timeline? After you've reviewed your Form I-20 for just a few minutes tonight, you may have some additional questions or a better sense of your timeline. So we'll talk about that. The third question that comes up is often not asked directly like this, but a version of it comes by, and that is, what does it mean to be authorized? And we want to talk about that because that authorization is coming from USCIS now, and that authorization has some limitations and has some really important deadlines that you need to be aware of. So we're going to talk about what does it mean to be authorized for work, how do I know I'm authorized, and how does that process happen? And then fourth, what are my responsibilities? I really appreciate Notre Dame students for their commitment to doing things well and being effective in all that you're doing. And that also is going to apply to your OPT application journey and while you're waiting and after you've graduated and you're accessing the benefits in your first year or couple of years of authorization. It's really essential to know what your responsibilities are going to be. Where are you reporting? What do you need to know about all these different elements of how to access different job opportunities, how to be present, be ready, be able to talk to employers about what you're eligible for, what you're able to do, and how are those different from when you were an enrolled student. So that's a brief overview of kind of where we're gonna go in the next hour. Probably our presentation will run about a half hour, and we wanna leave about 20 minutes at the end for questions if you have any, but again, put them in the Q&A throughout the presentation. We may answer them, We may not, but we'll be checking that to answer. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Cynthia to do a review of optional practical training, the big ideas of optional practical training, or OPT.
Thank you very much, Leah. So basically what OPT is OPT is the benefit that you're going to use after graduation to remain in the United States to get work experience. It's different from the CPT, which you use for internship. OPT is you're going to use after. To be eligible for OPT, you must be enrolled in your major for 12 months. You're allowed OPT once for each educational level that you achieve. So if you're here now and you're getting a bachelor's degree, you can get OPT. If you come back for a master's degree here or at another institution, you're eligible for OPT again. If you were to come back for a PhD here at another institution, you are eligible for OPT again. OPT, you are allowed once at each higher level of an educational level. Applying for OPT, it's valid once you're into your program. So you will want to begin looking at applying for OPT 90 days before your current program ends. And when I say your current program end, we're talking about the end date that's printed on your Form I-20. And we'll get more into that a little bit later in this presentation. So you can apply as early as 90 days before then, but you must have a start date for your authorization within 60 days or before the end of your 60-day grace period while you're still in your F status. I just want to say the reason what that 60th day is because if you don't apply by then, your grace period is up and you no longer have an F status to apply. So we want to make sure that we do time. One thing I want to make sure that everyone knows and understand is that you do not need a job offer to apply for OPT. At the earliest time possible, you want to make sure that you are applying if you intend to stay in the United States to work after your authorization. So if you have a job offer, that is totally fine. If you do not have a job offer, that is still totally fine. As I mentioned in the previous slide, your start date must be within 60 days of your program ending, which is before your grace period ends. In OPT, so we're just talking about regular post-completion OPT now, that is for a total of 12 months. But then during that 12 months, you're allowed days of unemployment, which cannot more than 90 days. Unlike CPT, which we authorize in our office, your OPT application, you're going to physically mail out to USCIS, and they are the ones who will approve your application. We will help you with the recommendation, but as far as the approval of your application, that does not come from our office, that is from USCIS. The processing time, right now, due to the current situation, and they have furloughed employees and people working remotely, it was taking an average from last year to take 2 to 5 months for the applications to be adjudicated. So even though it's taken 2 to 5 months, you still cannot apply more than 90 days before your program end date. And unlike CPT, for OPT, the current filing fee for this is $410 US that you would need to submit with your application to apply for OPT work authorization. So now we're just going to briefly talk about the different type of works opportunities that are allowed while you're on CPT. So as I mentioned, OPT is for 12 months, and the work that you take on for OPT must be related to your degree. So the work can be paid, it can be unpaid, it can be volunteer, you can be self-employed on OPT, you can be an independent contractor, You can I think I said it, but you can do a volunteer experience as well. One thing to consider when you're on OPT, you must work more than 20 hours per week, full-time status. So for normal purposes, 40 hours a week is considered full-time, but for your OPT application and employment purposes, as long as you're working more than 20 hours per week, which is considered full-time for the status. Slide, please. One thing that is coming up more now with the current situation is working remotely while OPT. So currently, policies are allowing for students to work remotely while on OPT. The only thing with this is, say, if your company's here in the US, but then you go back to your home country, your employer must be able to monitor and assess your work electronically while you're on OPT. So if it is the case, when you're reporting your OPT employment, even though you're physically outside of the country, you always want to make sure that you are reporting the company's US address as your work address. And then there's a little space in there that you can indicate that you're working remotely, the information there for us. Next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the I-20 program end date, and that just came through as a question in the Q&A because this semester, as we all know, the semester dates did change. And most of you have this May 16th, 2021 end date on your I-20. If you have your I-20 with you right now, you could check it. Some of you may have a program end date further in the future, but this did change, so there may be some impact. We are not automatically updating everyone's program end dates because we know that we'll do that when you are applying for OPT. We're going to talk about that end date. We will note that the US government is much more interested in the date that you meet degree requirements than an administrative graduation date. So especially because most of our students on the call today are undergraduate students, most of you can choose May 19th, which is the final day of classes. You've met your degree requirements, or you can choose your graduation day, which is May 23rd, simply because there's not that much difference between those dates. If you, for some reason, are actually finishing all of your finals early on May 16th, that's the date you want to keep. We're fine with that because some of these dates have really shifted this year. But ultimately, most of you will choose May 19th, May 23rd. So I would recommend that you write that down. Because it's going to become important as we talk about your timeline, your particular timeline. For the graduate students who are on the call, if you do not have a thesis or dissertation and you have only coursework, then you're going to have that same May 19th, May 23rd, or May 16th if you don't want to change your I-20 program end date. That's going to be your I-20 program end date. For any graduate students who might be on the call who do have a thesis or dissertation, we're going to need you to choose the dissertation defense date plus 30 days. If that runs into the graduation date, then the graduation date for that semester is the last possible date that you can have as your program end date. And this is something we can talk about with you more one-on-one. You can always schedule an appointment if you have questions. Most of you are undergraduate students on the call, so you're going to have May 19th, May 23rd, and in some cases, you may keep that May 16th date. So program end date. This date is actually going to set up all of the other timelines for your OPT application process. And it's going to set when you choose your authorization start date. It's going to establish to some degree when you submit your application packet. So you want to be very clear about this as you're making your plans. Nobody can choose a program end date beyond the university's published graduation date, unless you will be enrolled in a future semester at the same education level. Everyone is going to have that same May 2021 graduation date as the absolute final date that you can choose for your I-20 program end date. And again, if you decide, oh, I really want to just take one more class this summer, but you actually have met all of the degree requirements for your degree, then you need to be completed this May because the US government is just not that interested in having you take classes beyond your degree requirements. So keep that in mind. move to the next slide, where we are going to talk a little bit about travel. And this, I think, slide got out of the way, but we'll go ahead and tackle it because it is connected to this program end date to some degree. A lot of students ask us, can I travel while I'm on OPT? Can I travel while I'm waiting on my OPT to be authorized? And so what we would tell you is that before your program end date and after you have your EAD card in hand, you are traveling with the same risk of travel that you have had whenever you were enrolled as an F1 student. So in the last year, a lot of students had a valid visa, they had the I-20, they had what they needed to enter the US, but travel restrictions kept them from entering. In some cases, students got to the plane and they were denied entry. But that's always going to be a risk when you are an enrolled student. The Border Patrol officers have full authority to allow you to enter the US. So once you are, from now until the program end date on your I-20, the risk of traveling while in F1 status, exiting the US, coming back into the US, the same as it's ever been. The risk of traveling after you have your EAD card in hand and you have your I-20 and you have your valid F1 visa, again, the same level of risk as any other time. Where it's very risky, much higher risk to travel is after your program end date and before you have your EAD card or your approval for OPT. And so I'll give you a scenario. We had a student who recently submitted her OPT application. She was a January graduate. She's in her grace period, so she has a 60-day grace period. And her packet went to USCIS, and within a week, they sent it back to her and denied it, rejected it. So she's within her grace period, and fortunately, she's still in the US. So she is going to look at and review the mistake that she made on that packet. She's going to resubmit her packet and then hope that this time USCIS gets it and everything is fine, right? If she was outside of the US right now, when USCIS rejected her packet, she is past her program end date. Her application to extend her status has been denied. She does not have a status to return to if she's outside of the US. And so we cannot guarantee where USCIS is ever going to deny or reject your application. But after your program end date, through receiving that EAD card is the riskiest time to exit the US. And so you want to be thinking about that. You've got a few months to think about it. If you're going to travel or visit family, I know it's a complicated thing already in the midst of a health crisis. If you're going to do that, you want to do that before the program end date or plan on waiting until your EAD card comes. And Cynthia referenced last year, some students received their EAD cards in 2 months. Other students received them in 5 or 6 months after they had submitted the application. And because of the delays with USCIS, we just don't know how long it's going to take them this spring. So take that into consideration when you're planning travel. After your program end date, before you receive your EAD card, is very high risk. We would strongly advise you to avoid travel and exiting the US if you can. So we want to talk a little bit more about other things with the OPT timeline. And we talked about this program end date being the central date for you establishing when you're going to apply and what authorization date you are going to choose. So we'll assume that all of you have May 16th, 2021 printed on your I-20, because most of you do, and that's going to remain the same. But all of the information we're giving will adjust based on your program end date. So if your program end date is May 16th, the earliest that USCIS will allow you to submit your application packet is February 17th. So if they receive your application packet on February 16th, they will reject it, send it back to you, you will have to resubmit. If you submit it too late, which I'll talk about in a second, they'll reject it, send it back to you, you've missed out your opportunity to apply for OPT. So you submit it on February 17th, they get it, they will send you within a few weeks, hopefully, a receipt notice that basically says, we got it. We have your application. That's all the receipt notice means. They have your application. And then that's what you'll have. That's the document you'll have for this process until they approve your application. So February 17th, the program end date, May 16th, that's 90 days. If you decide, I don't know if I want to stay, I don't know if I want to go, we would really recommend you actually still submit the application, especially if you're a bachelor's student, because it's highly unlikely you're going to come back and do another bachelor's degree. So you're really not missing much by submitting the application and just holding that space. Because if you decide not to submit it and you submit it later, you may just lose time of the 12 months. There's really almost no benefit to not filling out the application unless you don't want to pay the fee, which is fair. But you also, after your program end date, you have 60 days where you can still submit that application if you are present in the US. After your program end date, once you're outside of the US, if you have not filed an OPT application, your F1 status is done. And so that program end date becomes really essential as you make your plans over the summer. You have 60 days to submit that application. And those 60 days are important also because that is the period in which you will choose an authorization date. So you are telling USCIS, this is the date that I want my authorization period to begin. And you'll report back to us in an ISSALink form. We will give you the I-20 with OPT recommendation with the date that you define. And that date has to be May 17th to July 15th. That's the 60-day period after your program end date in which your OPT must begin. That does not mean your job has to begin in that window. And Cynthia mentioned the unemployment days that you have. So let's say you do not have a job, so you choose July 15th as your last possible authorization date because you're just like, it's a hard market right now with the health crisis. I'm just not sure. I want to give myself as much time to find the right job. So a student might very strategically choose July 15th as the authorization start date on the card, and they don't necessarily have to begin working until October 14th, because that's that 90 days of unemployment that the regs allow you while you're on OPT in that first 12 months. If you get to October 15th, you still don't have a job, you still haven't reported employment, then you would have to depart the US at that point. But you do have some flexibility after graduation to find the right fit, to try out some things. But your authorization start date is going to be within that 60-day window. And there's really no budging on that. So if you choose May 19th, you decide I want the last day of finals to be my day, then July 18th is going to be the last possible start date you can choose for that OPT application. And we'll talk a little bit about different strategies that students may have in a minute. The other thing is I talked about that travel. You can choose after you hit that program end date, if you exit the US, again, that's the highest risk moment for travel because you won't have a status to come back to if for some reason your OPT application is denied. We've also had students who left and they said, I don't want to do OPT. They exited the US and they called us sometime in July or August or October and said, oh no, I found a job. I want to come back and do OPT. But if they did not apply for the authorization, they've lost that benefit for that education level and that for that degree. So we have a couple of examples that we want to just talk through to give you a sense of the different scenarios that we hear about from students. And we'll just focus on a few different examples. So for Young, he has an employment offer. His employment start date is May 20th, so not that far after the final day of final exams. So if his program end date is May 19th and he wants May 20th as that job start date, that is a very tight deadline because again, as Cynthia noted, it could take USCIS 5 months to process your OPT application. So he needs to be communicating with his employer about like, what is it that I'm trying to accomplish? Jan's visa is valid through 5/17/21. And so he knows that once he exits the US after May 17th, he'll have to apply for a new visa. But if he decides to stay through the summer, he's waiting on his EAD card to come back, he's fine. But when he wants to visit home in the next year, he's going to have to get the new F1 visa to re-enter the US. So he's still going to need the valid visa, still going to need a valid I-20 in order to travel because the EAD card is not a travel document. It's an employment document. If that EAD card does not come in time for a May 20 start date, Yang is going to have to wait. He cannot begin working until he has the EAD card in his hands and he has reached the start date printed on the card. And that's that authorization start date that you're choosing as the applicant. So Yang has a few things. He's going to have to be very open with his employer. He's going to have to be really flexible. There's no way to expedite USCIS processing. And so he's going to have to just be waiting, get his application in, keep an eye on the mail, but he's really just waiting for USCIS to make that determination and communicating with his employer. We would definitely say, stay here until you've got that EAD card in hand, and then work with your employer, because once you exit, we all know now, consulates being closed, delays, backlogs, it could be a while before he can get a visa and return to the US to continue working. So we would say probably stay here as long as you possibly can until it looks like the situation has cleared. Fatima has an employment offer. She's also a May 2021 graduate. Her start date though isn't until September. So she knows she has to choose an authorization period, authorization start date between May 17 and July 15, but her start date isn't until September 1st. So we would say in this case, if you're sure you are not going to find any other opportunity over the summer, no research in a lab, no supporting a professor that you love and doing some research with them over the summer, then you could probably choose July 15th as your authorization start date. And then you're only going to have about 2 weeks of unemployment that you're using up. And that's 2 weeks or, 6 weeks, 2 to 6 weeks of unemployment. And that's fine. You have those days of unemployment to use strategically within the OPT authorization year. In her case, she also wants to go home until August 15th, and her visa actually expires August 30th. So we would have two other pieces of advice for Fatima. We would say definitely avoid traveling until you have your authorization card in hand, or at least the approval notice, which we'll talk about in a second. And then absolutely make sure that you get back by August 30th so that she doesn't have to apply for another visa. But she could enter on August 30th with that current visa, and still it's a valid visa until the day that it expires. So she has a couple of things to consider, but she can use unemployment strategically. She can apply now and give USCIS all the possible time to process her application, get her EAD card as soon as possible, so she has more flexibility in traveling home. So it's some things that she needs to be strategic about. We have a student, Ahan, who plans to return to his home country to work after graduation, doesn't plan to apply for OPT, has no desire to work in the US after graduation, has a really good opportunity elsewhere. And we would say, congratulations, that sounds amazing, but really consider, is there any possibility that you may change your mind in the next 7 months? Because if there's a possibility, especially for our students who are undergrads, that you have a plan to go to grad school, but then it doesn't work out, or you have a plan to get a job back in your home country or a third country, and it doesn't work out, there may be some benefits to still applying for OPT. And we would again advise in the same way, if you're going to do that, do it now. And do it as soon as possible. For our fourth student and final student, Claire, she's going to be graduating in May of 2021. She does not have a job, but she's still looking. And her visa is expired, but she doesn't plan to do any travel. And this is a great situation. We would give Claire the same advice. You need to apply, submit your application in February, get that in as soon as possible. And you have some options about where you want to set your start date for a job. So last summer, 2 summers ago, I think we had a student who chose July 15th as his start date because he had a job that started on August 15th. And he was like, July 15th is the last possible day. I just don't want to lose unemployment. Just going to do that July 15th, and then I can start my job on August 15th. But right about when he was graduating, he found out about an opportunity to begin working in June. And so he thought that it would be fine because he had already applied for OPT to begin to work in June. And unfortunately, he went ahead and did that without authorization, which had some pretty negative impact on his OPT application and his ability to access the benefit, and he had to leave the US. And so it's really essential that when you're considering that start date, you understand that's the date that the US government has authorized you to start working. If Notre Dame professor talks to you as you're getting ready to graduate and they're like, oh my gosh, I'd love to work with you over the summer and do some research, or I'm working on this article, if you want to help me edit it and do some research for this article, or there's some extra lab work, I'd love to have you as a lab assistant this summer. Those are all amazing opportunities. But once you hit your program end date, you have to have USCIS authorization to participate. You have to have the EAD card. You have to have reached the start date on your card. It's just incredibly essential for that. So I keep talking about the authorization start date. You want to think about, when am I actually authorized to work? It doesn't matter if it's unpaid or paid. Either of those opportunities are okay with OPT. If you are doing something that could potentially be paid, if you are offering a service to somebody and it's paid or unpaid, beyond walking someone's dogs as a favor, or serving at a religious ceremony, or feeding the hungry, beyond that, most of the opportunities you will have after graduation, you should have authorization for. And so it's important that you wait until you reach the authorization start date on your EAD card. Again, it will be different from your employment start date. In most cases, students have, say, a July 1st authorization start date, but don't start working until July 15th. That's fine. By setting that date earlier, you're just giving yourself a window of flexibility for whatever your plans are. And again, as we've learned in the last year, no plans are certain. So you really want to remain flexible as you're thinking about what opportunity you might want to take advantage of this coming summer and fall. You want to be considering how flexible you want to be in talking with employers. If you choose a June 1st start date, even though you do not have a job offer now, it does offer you a degree of flexibility when you are talking with an employer. Like, I expect to be authorized by June 1st. I'm waiting on the card from USCIS, but that's the date that I've requested for authorization to begin working. And then remembering that the date you set for authorization is the date that you set, and that is the date that USCIS would use. And once you send your application packet to USCIS, that's it. There may be a small window in which you can try and change that authorization start date, but it is a small window. And with the post office and USCIS delays, really would recommend that you understand, once you send off your packet, you have told USCIS when you want to be authorized, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to make any changes to that. So that date you set is the date you set. Super, super important.
All right, so we've been talking about, this is the work authorization card. It's called the EAD card. This is the card that you are going to get when your OPT has been approved. It's very important that you do not begin any work until you have received this EAD card and the start date on the card has been reached. And what I mean by that is, if it says that your OPT is going to begin on July 15th, but then you get the card on July 10th, even though you have the card in hand, it's not July 15th, so you cannot begin working yet. So you want to make sure that you have the card in hand and the date on the card has been reached. Also, you're going to notice at the bottom of the card, it says not valid for re-entry to the US. The EAD card alone is not a travel document. Yes, you will need this document to re-enter the United States if you exit, but you also need to have your other immigration documents with you. So you will need to have the valid passport, the valid visa, and then your OPT I-20 to re-enter the United States. Not everyone, but most students, when they apply, well, when you apply for OPT, so everyone will receive a receipt notice, as Leah has mentioned earlier, and that receipt notice is just verification that they received your application. So everyone will definitely get that. There is also a OPT approval notice, and this notice basically just says your OPT has been approved to let you know that your card is coming. So depending on the adjudicator, you may or may not receive that approval notice. So if you're one of the ones that receives that approval notice, you cannot use that approval notice to begin working. It's not the same as your EAD card. You have to physically wait till you actually have the card, which everyone will receive. One thing you want to make sure when you get your EAD card, you want to review all the information that is on the card. So the card will look just like the example we have here, and it's basically the size of like a credit card or your Notre Dame ID. It's going to have your picture on it, which they're going to get from photos that you submit. It's going to have your name, your country of birth, your date of birth, and your authorization dates. And those are the main things you want to look at on that card. Is your name correct? Is your country of birth correct? Is your birth date correct? Are your authorization dates correct? Review it for its accuracy, and if it's not correct, make sure you contact us for instructions on how to get that card corrected. There is a tracking process for when applying, submitting your OPT packet. So once you get your OPT receipt, on that receipt will be a receipt number where you can track the process of your application. So once you're doing your tracking, you want to make sure where you notice, so when it says your application has been approved, or if it says set for processing, they all mean different things. So you want to make sure that you're reading everything as accurate as possible. And if no. So you may see ones, once you log in, it says your application has been approved. Or you may see another that means something was sent for processing. So once your application is approved, then when it says sent for processing, that's the process when they are generating your EAD card. So from the time that you see that notice that it's been sent for processing and your OPT has been approved, it could be anywhere between a 4 to 6 week delay before you actually receive the physical card, the EAD card, for you to begin working. So just to go back, even though you have the OPT approval notice, you want to wait until you actually have the card in hand before you begin working. Something else I want to add on here is you want to treat this EAD card like a credit card or something very important. Once you get the card, you want to show it to your employer, but don't physically give them the card to keep. You want to keep the card yourself. Just make a copy of it, keep it in your purse or wallet, and keep the original up after you show it to your employer. Because this card is your work authorization card. So if you show this to your current employer and you begin working, everything's fine. Say you go to switch employers and you've lost your card, you have no work authorization card to show them that you've been authorized to work. So I would just say you make sure you keep this in a secure place. Don't give it to anyone, and just keep it locked up so you have it when you need it. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about the different reporting responsibilities while you're on OPT. So even though you will have graduated and you're on OPT, you'll still be considered as we will still consider you as a student in F1 status. So you will still have reporting responsibilities to us and to USCIS. So as with what you do now, you have 10 days to report all changes. So if you obtain a new employer, you lose your employer, you move, you have 10 days to report those changes. Once you want to make sure you're doing this on time, because we cannot backdate or pre-report any information. So say you began working on just July 15th, and then come August 15th, you realize you hadn't reported it. So once you go in and report it, we can't backdate it back to that July 1st date. So you're going to have to end up using some of your unemployment days since it was not reported on time. And you also can't pre-report your unemployment. So if you know that you have a job and it starts on August 1st, you can't report it on July 1st to let us know that your employment is going to begin on this day. You only can report it 10 days in advance. That's and the soonest you can report it. So once your OPT is approved, you're going to get an email from SEVP. And SEVP is basically the student reporting portal. So what this is this is going to give you access to report your information to the U.S. government yourself. So once your OPT is approved, you will receive an email from SEVP with giving you the information on how to set up your portal. The one important thing to note is that once you receive this email, this is only valid for 2 weeks. So they give you 2 weeks to actually set this up. After the 2 weeks, if nothing is done, your link is expired, you can't access it anymore. But what you can do, so if you have any problems setting up your SEVP student portal, or you did not receive it, you can contact our office and we can work on getting that to you. Next, please. Okay, so briefly, we're just going to talk about the 24-month STEM OPT. So this is only for individuals who are in a STEM field. So post-completion OPT, which everyone applies for, is 12 months. If you're in a STEM field, you can apply for an OPT extension. So instead of your OPT being 1 year, you'll get 3 years of OPT. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you mark on your calendars 9 months after your OPT is approved. 9 months later, that's when you want to begin the process of submitting everything for the STEM OPT application. So what I suggest is once you apply for regular post-completion application, that entire packet that you're going to have, make a copy of everything because you're going to need that same information for the next application you complete. And it'll be the same thing. You'll get a new EAD card, you fill out another 7-page application, you'll do everything all over again that you did for post-completion OPT. So I just suggest make a copy of the entire packet before you mail it off, lock it up until you need it to complete your STEM application. The only difference between post-completion and STEM OPT, for post-completion OPT, you do not have to have a job offer to apply. For STEM, you must have a job offer to apply, and it must be a paid position. So regular OPT can be paid or unpaid. STEM, it must be a paid position. And there are limits on the types of employment that you can do with STEM. We'll go into more of that later. But the main thing to note here is that if you are a STEM eligible student, you want to begin the process after your OPT has been approved for 9 months.
Thanks, Cynthia. A few questions just from the last section, a couple of questions around travel. So I'll just touch base on those. One is that if you have your approval notice, it is much safer to travel with your approval notice. It's almost as good as the EAD card. Typically that approval notice, I think Cynthia said this, but just a reminder, comes about 2 weeks before your card arrives. So they come pretty close to each other. Approval notice is a much better document to travel with than the receipt notice or with no document at all. So that could be okay. And also a few students asked about travel signatures, and that's a great question. So once you are on OPT, if you're traveling, exiting the US, coming back in over that year, then you will need an updated travel signature. And instead of the 1 year validity, it's only valid for 6 months. So you do want to make sure that you're checking in with us, requesting a new I-20 through ISSALink when you need that updated document. And then a few students asked about when you get the new I-20, and you do need a new I-20 for the OPT recommendation to mail off with your packet. So we'll talk about that a little bit more now. Kind of the timeline, general timeline. You have that timeline to consider of choosing an authorization start date and submitting your application. And here's an overview of what to expect in the next couple of weeks, particularly. So we definitely want to just be really aware of the OPT requirements. That's why we're having this conversation. Your first step is to go to ISSALink and complete the OPT application form and submit that. When you submit that, your academic advisor that you identify is actually going to also have to submit a recommendation for you. And all they are doing is confirming that you are eligible to graduate this May. But they will need that information. They'll have to do that before we can proceed. It's your responsibility to follow up with your academic advisor, make sure they saw the form, make sure they submitted it. You can always check in with us to see if they have done so, but just know it's your responsibility to follow up on that. The second form in ISSALink that you're going to fill out is, this is slightly different. We're doing because of the health crisis and the inability to have students come in with all of their documents. So within ISSALink, there is a Submit OPT I-76 application draft form. And you are going to upload your completed I-765 and some of the required documents that you will need for your application packet. And our office is going to review your uploaded packet and make recommendations. What are the main mistakes that we see? Did you cross things off? Did you fill all the boxes? Did you sign the right page? We just had a student whose OPT application was rejected simply because she had forgotten to sign something. And I will say that typically the only rejections or denials that we see are because students made a mistake on the application. They submitted their documents too early or too late, or they simply forgot to sign one of the pieces of paper. So really, you are eligible for the benefit if you submit a timely, accurate, complete application. Your chances of being approved are incredibly strong. There's almost no case in which a student did everything right that it wasn't approved, right? And we don't have any examples of that. So you want to just pay attention to that. And that's why we're offering that session next week, is to go through that process. It's going to feel a little bit like, I know how to fill out a form, but there's just a few things that make it a little bit tricky. And then when you submit it, it's submitted. They've got it. If you want, you can schedule an appointment with an ISSA advisor to talk through the application. If you want to go over the corrections, if you just want a little bit more conversation about the process, you have more questions, we will have about 60 appointments available each week for students to sign up with. Once you have your completed packet and you've done the review, you've gotten the new I-20 from ISSA, then we will give you kind of a few instructions for where to send it, where to find information about where to file it, but then you are sending it to USCIS. And that's really important that you understand you are the final processor, right? That's going to get that application to USCIS. We can provide the courtesy review. We are requiring the updated I-20 with OPT recommendation, but ultimately the responsibility to submit it is yours. And then it's your responsibility to track the application status. And then it's your responsibility, of course, to maintain your status while you're on OPT. So reporting those employment and address changes, not beginning to work before you're authorized, not participating in work that is not related to your major. So if you find a really great opportunity to work in a theater, but you have a completely different major, maybe econ, and there's no real connection between being in the theater and working at a theater and your econ major, well, that would be considered by USCIS a violation of your status. That employment within your 12 months of OPT, every opportunity must be connected to your major or majors if you have two listed. Your academic advisor is just going to recommend OPT, again, just signing off to say, yes, the student's getting ready to graduate, they're eligible. They're going to verify that you've met your degree requirements, and then we'll issue that new I-20. So a few takeaways. One, and I just said it, I'll say it again, you as the F1 visa holder are driving this process. You are getting the documents submitted, you're filling out the applications, you're sending them off. We are here to support you and provide guidance and advice, but you ultimately are going to be taking charge of this. It seems, I will say, often for students, they'll come in and say, I thought this was going to be so much harder. And it wasn't. Like, I'm done, I've sent it off. And it is really stressful because you're waiting for this US government agency to do the evaluation. But in terms of like hard work, it isn't. You just have a lot of details to gather, forms to fill out, get everything together, follow the steps. But it's your responsibility to move forward on that. Second, you really want to make sure you have a good sense of your timeline before you request the OPT and submit that OPT application. That's where you're going to tell us where what date you want us to put on your I-20. A note that USCIS does not guarantee the processing times, and we cannot expedite. They won't expedite. There's not a lot to do once you've sent off the application. It's a waiting game. A reminder that you don't need a job offer, and whether you have a job offer or not, no matter when that job starts, we would highly recommend you get that OPT application in by the end of February. And then finally, just remain flexible. You're going to do the work, you're going to get it in, and then there's just going to be waiting and adjusting, and just remain flexible, open, It's going to be fine. It is a stressful wait as you're doing so many other things, but once it's in, it's out of your hands. It's in the hands of USCIS.
It is. One thing I wanted to add before we move on, Leah kept mentioning how important it was to not begin working before you received your EAD card and the date on the card has been reached. It's also important that you do not continue to work after your OPT authorization has ended. Say your OPT has ended and your company wants you to stay a week or two longer, you cannot. Once your OPT end date ends, you have to stop working on that day.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And those of you who have applied for STEM, you have to submit that application. The last possible date is the end date on your EAD card. And we'll send you reminders over the next year and especially next spring about what to do and consider. But that will also be important at the end. So next steps, you are going to complete the OPT application form once you know what authorization dates you want to request. We highly recommend that you attend next week's application review session where we're just going to go through the I-765 and the documents to show you some sample I-765 application packets to make that really easy and familiar. And after that, you want to complete the Form I-765, gather your application documents, and you're going to submit that whole packet in the PDF to the OPT I-765 application draft form at IFALink. So it looks like we have a few other questions, and so we'll tackle those in our remaining 7 minutes. I did have a student just asked, a couple students asked about the what address to use on the I-765, and it is a little bit tricky because you do need an address that's going to be valid for the next 3 or 4 weeks and an address that will be valid for, say, the next 5 months. And you're graduating, your address is going to change, you're moving on someplace else in many cases. So you may need to find someone who has a more stable address, or USCIS does have a portal where you can report address updates. And you generally want to do that at least 3 weeks in advance of when you expect to be getting your card. If you're at the end of 3 months, give them some time to update your record. But there is a way to update your address with USCIS. If you have a family member or a friend that's here that you could just put their address down, we'll talk about it next week, but that's what we would recommend. Somebody has asked, do I have to graduate if I file for OPT? What's the difference between pre and post completion? And can I use the STEM extension if I hold pre-completion? Lots of questions, good questions there.
Can you take that one?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so pre-completion OPT is what you would use before you graduate. So say you're a junior and you have this work opportunity that you want to take and you cannot use CPT. So then you would have to use pre-completion OPT. The one thing about this to think about is you're only allowed 12 months of OPT. So whatever you use from pre-completion CPT, we subtract from your post-completion OPT. So you might not get the full year at the end of graduation. So if you're able to use CPT for the opportunity that you have before graduating, that's what you want to consider using instead of using pre-completion OPT. Let me pull the box back up and read your question. Do I have to graduate if I file for OPT? Yes, so OPT, post-completion OPT is what you're using at the end of your program. So say right now your program end date is May and you're not going to graduate in May, you will want to work with your academic advisor about applying for a program extension to extend your program, and don't apply for OPT if needed. Can I use STEM? Can I use the STEM extension if I hold pre-completion OPT? Okay, yeah, so those are all the 3 different OPTs that are available. So the STEM extension is is the extension of the post-completion OPT. So that's separate from the pre and the post-completion, if that makes sense. Did I answer that for you well, good enough? I can't hear or see. I'm like, yes, I can hear or see.
Yep. He said,
okay.
They said yes, perfect.
Thank you.
So we have a question that one thing we did not talk about today, and I'll just address it here, is the H-1B lottery, because there have been a number of changes made even in the last 3 weeks about the lottery process for this year, and we do not advise on H-1B. So the one thing we can advise you on, though, is that if your employer wants you to start before the H-1B visa status begins in October, then you should apply for OPT. If you are like, nope, I'm just going to wait for my employer to submit that, see if I get it, great. That's fine. But if you are not caught in the lottery, or however they do it this year, if you are not chosen, then you don't have a work status. You can submit an OPT application and the H-1B, apply for the H-1B lottery at the same time. And generally, we would recommend that you do that, so that just in case that the lottery doesn't happen, your H-1B packet doesn't happen, approval doesn't happen, you still have authorization to work for the next year, or you at least have that gap filled between your graduation date and October 1st, which is when the H-1B start date typically is. So definitely consider applying for both. If you're going to do that, you're probably going to need all of your I-20s that you've ever had for that H-1B application, and you can just email our office and request them, and we'll provide those for you of whatever we have on file. Somebody asked about if my job starts in September, but I'm not sure of the exact start date. So to be safe, should I just make my OPT start date in June 30th? This could be correct. You could choose as late as July 15th. But if you felt more comfortable with that June 30th, you can choose June 30th as your start date. If you don't start until September, then you are going to be using just a few more weeks of unemployment up. And that may be something to consider as you're choosing your authorization start date. And then somebody asked about, can changing your address in the USCIS portal 3 weeks before harm your application? It won't have any impact. You're really just telling them, this is where I need you to mail my packet now, or mail my EAD card. It doesn't impact their decision about your EAD card and whether they're going to approve it. They're very separate processes. So it's more administrative. And someone asked about a little bit, oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, this is where it's going to ensure that you receive your EAD card, because this federal mail will not forward. So if you give them an address and you're not there, it's going to be returned and sent back to them. It's very, very difficult to get the card returned back to you. So if you know you're not going to be at that address, just update your address so they can send it to you where you are.
Yeah. Within
the United States.
Yeah, no, that's good. Good point. Holly had just a question more about the lottery. We have a link to a presentation on the H-1B lottery that we can send. Unfortunately, like I said, they've made some changes, and we don't know if those changes are going to stick or what to expect from this year's lottery. But really, to participate in the H-1B lottery, you have to have an employer who is willing to file on your behalf. It isn't something that you would file for or you would apply for. It's going to be employer initiated, and typically they would have already identified you as a candidate by this point. So because that lottery is coming up in early April. So, but if you are here for the year in OPT and next year's lottery, you have an employer who wants to sponsor you, you would totally be eligible to be sponsored for the H-1B lottery. Typically, there are about 85,000 applications chosen to be in the lottery, and about 60,000 of those could be for bachelor's or master's students combined, and then 20,000 just for master's and PhD students. So yeah, so it's a great opportunity, but you know, they have 80,000 application spots that they take, and usually about 240,000 people apply for them. So it can be a tough, a true lottery can be a tough game. So it looks like we have just one or two more questions. We'll do those and then wrap up. So since we're at 7 o'clock, after I get my EAD card, I'll need to always have the F1 and the I-20 with the OPT recommendation to leave and re-enter the US. Absolutely. Super important. You are still in F1 status. Your EAD card is not a travel document. It is an employment document. And you need those status documents for travel. And that's why getting the travel signature every 6 months is super important. And then, will I be able to make changes to the OPT start date? You can make changes before you mail off your application. So if you set that start date, we go in and recommend your OPT with those start dates, and then you set an appointment with us a week later and you're like, I don't like this date, I need to change it, we can change it then. Once you've submitted your application to USCIS, it's incredibly difficult. There's a very small window where you might still be able to change it. But for the most part, you need to know what your start date is before you send off that application. I do not see any other questions. We will send a reminder with the RSVP and the information about next week's session. And you'll also get a reminder email from us next week about applying for OPT, a link to where this video will be on our website. So you can go back and listen to any of it that you think you might have missed. I know it is so much information. It is not super exciting. It's hard to jazz up OPT, but it is going to be an incredible opportunity for you if you submit all of this correctly and get it out there. So really grateful you guys were here to spend the time with us. Please reach out to ISSA at indy.edu if you have any follow-up questions, and we'll have more instructions to come. I hope to see you next week. Have a great night.
Great night, everyone.